A mother's search for her daughter spans 2 decades. She no longer knows what her child looks like. Will digital technology help locate her? A man slays his family and vanishes without a trace for 18 years. Can the work of a sculptor flush him out of hiding? 2 hunters stumble across human remains. Can an artist put flesh on the bones and give the victim a name? Forensic artists combine science, intuition, and skill to build likenesses of the murdered and the missing. Their work can reunite families or help solve a murder, creating faces of hope and faces of tragedy. Under a gray Texas sky in the winter of 1994, 2 hunters trespassed on private land outside of Lubbock. But their offense would pale in comparison to what they'd discover that day in remote Yellow House Canyon. They stumbled onto the partial remains of a human skeleton and a white, high-heeled shoe lying nearby. Though alarmed by their discovery, they knew if they called the police, they'd be fined for poaching. The hunters decided to leave the bones for someone else to find. But when they told a friend what they'd seen, he called the sheriff. The hunters agreed to take Deputy Tom Watson of the Lubbock County Sheriff's Department to the site of their find. Watson immediately suspected the remains belonged to a murder victim, dumped in the canyon to conceal the crime. Only the skull and a few bones remained. Over time, animals must have dragged away parts of the body. Watson directed his deputies to tape off a wide area to be searched for more evidence. Once the crime scene had been documented on film, he called in the county pathologist to examine the bones. The pathologist collected the bones and took them back to his lab, where they could be examined for signs of trauma.
I don't believe we have any local people missing.
He confirmed Watson's suspicions. The victim was murdered. The upper part of the skeleton bore multiple stab marks, enough to kill a person several times over. The case was now officially a homicide. Watson returned to the canyon the next day to sweep for more evidence. To capture the killer, he first had to name the victim. But his search uncovered no form of identification. The only clothing was the one shoe. To identify his victim, he desperately needed more to go on.
The first thing we have to do is determine whether it's male, female, and approximate age. Check those statistics against any possible missing persons that we might have locally. If we don't find anything there, then we expand the search out statewide into New Mexico and Oklahoma. And then if we still haven't got her identified, then we go national with it.
The search team recovered more bones and, luckily, almost all of the victim's teeth, but nothing more. No personal effects that could clue them in to who the victim was or when the killing occurred. Watson turned the bones over to a forensic pathologist who was able to narrow down the possibilities. He concluded that the victim was a white female, 18 to 24 years old. The weathering on the bones suggested she'd been dead at least 2 years. Tooth fillings in the lower jaw and a crown in the upper jaw offered more identifying features. The teeth were x-rayed so they could be compared to dental charts of missing white females of the same age. Using the x-rays, Watson began a search to make a match. He chased dozens of leads, some from as far as New Jersey, but none matched the dental records of the woman found in Yellow House Canyon. His investigation was leading nowhere. Meanwhile, a killer remained free. Watson needed more than the victim's bones and teeth to identify her. He needed to give the woman a face. For that, he turned to one of America's leading experts on facial reconstruction. Karen Taylor has worked for the Texas Department of Public Safety in Austin for 16 years. As a forensic artist, she helps identify skeletons by recreating what the person looked like when alive. Her images are distributed by police and the media in the hopes that the remains will be identified. Using techniques she's developed over the years, Taylor has had remarkable success. She serves police jurisdictions throughout Texas and works on cases across the country. Her job keeps her extremely busy. The unidentified woman from Yellow House Canyon was one among many nameless persons awaiting a face.
Deputy Tom Watson from the Lubbock County Sheriff's Office brought me the skull of an unidentified white female found in that area, and he asked that I try to build a face on that skull to help him identify her. And the information was provided to me that had been developed by an anthropologist to examine the skeleton. And so I knew from Tom's reports that the person I was going to be drawing was a young white female. I unfortunately didn't have a lot of other information. There was no clothing, for instance. Clothing is a very good clue as to body weight for me from skeletal remains. There was also no hair, which provides a added complication, especially in a case of a female. So because there was so little to work with, the case was a little more difficult than some of them are.
Without the victim's clothing to use as a guideline, Taylor had to take her cues from the skull alone. When putting a face on a human skull, one of the most critical parts is determining how thick the flesh will be. Taylor relies on standard tables of measurements developed by forensic anthropologists and classified by sex and race. Based on these measurements, she cuts out rubber markers that match the average depth of the skin. She glues them onto the skull at 21 anthropological landmarks, like the cheeks and chin. When the markers are in place, photographs of the skull are taken. For Taylor to accurately draw the face, the photographs must be exactly life-size and not distorted at all. After placing transparent paper over the photograph, she uses the rubber markers as guides in drawing the facial contours. It's the first step in recreating the image that may lead to the identity of the victim. Taylor also relies on scientific formulas to draw in the eyes, nose, and other features. The average human eyeball is between 24 and 25 millimeters in diameter. Since this is also the size of a U.S. quarter, Taylor has a convenient tool for tracing in each eye.
I also know from reading some ophthalmology texts that the average person has an iris diameter, an iris width really, that is between 11 and 13 millimeters. And I have little red lines on this scale showing the average range. So And I've checked it on a number of people, and it seems to hold true for most everyone. Most everyone's iris will fall right in that range.
Taylor relies on her knowledge of anatomy to draw in the eyelids. On many people, the orbit, or eye socket, has a raised piece of bone on its outer edge. The inner edge of the socket has another bony landmark. These are the points of attachment for the ligament that stretches across the eyeball and controls the movement of the eyelid.
Our upper lids are curved slightly more than the lower lids. They tend to drop slightly over the top of the iris when looking at a person in life.
Taylor next draws the victim's nose, relying on some rules of thumb and hints provided by the skull.
Surprisingly, we do have some pretty good information about noses to help predict the look of a nose in life based on the bony clues.
Because the victim was a white female, Taylor knows to add 5 millimeters to each side of the nasal opening. That represents the width of the nose. If the victim were African American, Taylor would add 8 millimeters to each side. A bony spine at the base suggests how far the nose projects.
Because that little bit of bone tells me whether to tip the nose down or to tip it up or whether it's rather level. And so I'm looking at the profile to determine that angulation of the nasal spine, and that gives me a hint. In this case, this is quite an upturned nasal spine, so I want a tip of a nose that's up. She's a young girl. She's got a youthful little nose. And the nasal spine tells me it's turned up at the tip.
When the mouth is relaxed, the lips tend to cover the 6 front teeth. When we smile, we flash as many as 10 teeth. Taylor draws the unidentified woman's mouth in a relaxed expression to give her a neutral appearance.
So if I make a mark at the outside of those canines, that should give me an approximation of the width of the mouth. If you can see the staining of the gum line at the edge of the enamel of the teeth, gives us a ballpark idea of the vertical dimension for the lips. And again, I know that she's young, I know that she's white, so I'm thinking young white female as I draw this little mouth.
From a faceless skull, Taylor will soon create the image of a woman. She hopes it will give a name to the victim and eventually name the killer. As Karen Taylor added the finishing touches to her portrait of the unidentified woman, the victim's face was reborn. The image was now ready for prime time. Taylor's drawing was shown on television and local newspapers, giving anyone who recognized the woman the opportunity to provide information about her. For Sheriff's Deputy Tom Watson, the broadcast was a defining moment in the case.
This particular case was very frustrating for the first 6 months because we were not able to identify her. We were about to the end of all of our options as far as getting her identified until we did have the forensic drawing made. And once we aired that on the media, within a week we had 2 callers gave us the name of the dead girl.
The callers identified Taylor's drawing as Belinda K. Tillery, who'd been missing for 2 years. One of the callers was Tillery's mother, who had lost touch with her daughter. The face on the screen delivered an eerie shock of recognition. Now, with a name to go with the face, Taylor obtained a copy of Belinda Tillery's driver's license photograph. She compared it to her drawing to study the similarities that led to Tillery's identification. The resemblance was undeniable.
She has narrow or rather close-set eyes, and yet very broad face, broad cheeks. And this small nose, and the width of the nose proportionately is very close here. The mouth size is almost exactly right, and the fact that there's a very wide chin favorably compares also.
For closer identification, Taylor superimposed the photograph of Belinda Tillery onto the victim's skull.
As I was able to get the facial image on top of the skull and start to compare it, I had a couple of difficulties by this method. One being that her face is slightly turned in her driver's license photo, therefore I can't quite get the nose position correctly. However, when I put the eyes pretty much centered in the orbits, I see that she does have the facial width that my drawing shows and that I could see in this skull. So I could see that it's a pretty favorable comparison, and we probably should go ahead with finding dental records on this person if possible to make a more positive comparison.
A positive identification couldn't be made until X-rays of the victim's teeth were compared with dental records of Belinda Tillery.
From Lubbock.
Dr. David Duell, a forensic dentist with the Texas Department of Public Safety, made the comparison. He found the bone structure to be the same. Teeth with fillings matched. Both X-rays showed a root canal on the same tooth, and a temporary crown was identical on each film. Dr. Duell declared it a match. Taylor's work had identified the victim.
Is it a root canal?
It was now up to Deputy Watson to track down the killer. He started by interviewing Belinda Tillery's friends and neighbors. Watson learned that Tillery had had an abusive boyfriend named Troy Armstrong. It was rumored that he'd become angry when she told him she was pregnant with someone else's child. Watson obtained a photograph of Armstrong and went looking for him. He tracked him to Roswell, New Mexico. There, he searched the town. He questioned the locals, digging for any lead he could find. But Armstrong was gone. He'd found out that he was a suspect in Belinda's murder. Back in Lubbock, as Watson gathered more information, a picture of Belinda's last days became clearer. It had been 2 years since anyone had seen her. That's when some folks heard she'd gone camping with Armstrong. He liked to camp in Yellow House Canyon. It was a remote place that he knew well.
What's going on front, all right? I'll catch up with you, okay?
All right, well, come on.
People mentioned that he carried a large hunting knife almost everywhere he went. The pieces were fitting together. It seemed that a bitter Armstrong had planned to take Belinda to this remote canyon and get rid of her for good. He thought no one would find her remains. After Belinda's death, he told a girlfriend he had nightmares about stabbing someone in the back. Based on the evidence, Watson obtained a warrant for Troy Armstrong's arrest, but he still had no information on his whereabouts. More than a year later, in January 1996, Watson received a tip. He found out that Armstrong was on the road with a truck driver buddy who was hauling for a company in California. Watson quickly contacted the trucking company. He discovered that their trucks were equipped with a global positioning system called GPS. A transponder on each truck bounced a signal off a satellite, telling the company where it was at all times. They informed him that the truck he was looking for was now traveling through Nebraska. Within minutes, Watson got the Nebraska State Police on the other line and asked them to set up a roadblock. They dispatched several cars to intercept the truck. As the police waited, they maintained contact with Watson and the trucking company, keeping tabs on the truck's whereabouts at all times. They knew just when to expect it. When the truck came barreling down the highway, the driver saw the roadblock ahead. He tried to escape, but the police sprang into action. Once the truck was halted, the police moved in. Hiding inside was Troy Armstrong.
Police officer, get your hands
he was arrested for the murder of Belinda Tillery. By now, evidence against him had mounted. A former girlfriend and others admitted that he had confessed to killing Tillery. On December 5, 1996, Armstrong was convicted for murder and sentenced to life in prison. Karen Taylor's lifelike reconstruction of Belinda K. Tillery was the key to solving a difficult case. Without it, the victim would never have been identified, and the killer never brought to justice. Like the artist she was trained to be, Taylor relies on pen and paper to capture likenesses. Elsewhere, scientists are beginning to apply digital technology to achieve a similar goal. At Colorado State University in Fort Collins, they're developing equipment to match faces to skulls with laser beam accuracy. Mechanical engineering professor Patrick Fitzhorn and a graduate student combined computer-aided design with laser technology. They created a system that scans three-dimensional objects and reconstructs them in a computer.
So what this machine can do is build a three-dimensional surface mesh, computer surface mesh, of a human skull that we can then play with on the computer. We can scale it up and down, we can move it through space.
As the skull rotates slowly on the platter, a laser beam strikes it at 10,000 to 50,000 points. A sensor measures the distance the beam travels as it reflects off each point. The results are fed into a computer that creates a digital version of the skull. The image is virtual, but its application is real.
And obviously what we want to do with it then at that point is to fix it in space, to take a scanned facial photograph and to map the photograph on the skull to see whether there's a match or not.
A photograph of the would-be owner of the skull is also scanned. The digital photo can be cleaned up and sharpened. Here, Fitzhorn made the photograph semi-transparent so he could superimpose it over the skull. Now he can compare their features.
But here you can see the teeth in here. There's the bridge of the nose. Here are the eyes. There's the eyeball in its orb. There's the other eyeball in its orb. There's the end of the cheekbone here. The jaw line down in here.
Currently, a forensic artist relies on his best guess to determine whether a photograph matches a skull. He takes measurements and superimposes a photograph over a skull. But if the picture was taken from an odd angle, it could distort the results.
The mouth doesn't match up. And now what we're seeing is how the skull is oriented. You can see how it's rotated in here with respect to the photograph. So here, this is the plane that the photograph is in, and you can see the skewing of the skull with respect to it. Again, trying to line the skull up in orientation with respect to the way the face was oriented when the camera photograph was taken.
Fitzhorn can rotate the skull and reorient the scanned facial photograph to minimize the distortion. Some photos aren't clear enough or are too distorted to enhance, defying efforts to make a match that's 100% certain. But Fitzhorn is convinced that his method is much more precise, less subjective than previous methods.
But one of the things that I'm really excited about is the potential to take 4 or 5 points on the skull, to take 4 or 5 matching points on the face, and actually attempt to compute whether or not there's a match. What we'd like to be able to do is numerically compute this fit on the computer, and then be able to say something like, this is a 95% probability of match, or this is a 35% probability of match.
As Patrick Fitzhorn and his colleagues perfect their computer face matching system, forensic artists in Louisiana are on a different mission. Instead of applying digital technology to identify the dead, they're hoping to use it to find the living. In this case, a girl who's been missing for over 20 years. In 1976, in a small town in Louisiana, a family argument turned sour. It wasn't the first time Geneva Martin and her teenage daughter argued. But what started out as a typical mother-daughter conflict soon turned into a 21-year ordeal for Geneva Martin.
She was 16 years old, you know. She let her opinion be known, and I let my opinion be known, and she wasn't any more wrong than I was.
The argument ended as many before. The two went back to their chores without saying a word to each other. Then Donna decided to leave.
Bye, Mom.
She said she was going to her grandmother's house. It was 2:30 p.m. By 5, she hadn't returned, so her concerned mother went looking for her at her grandmother's. But Donna wasn't there. Her grandmother said Donna had gone next door to play cards with her Aunt Peggy.
Well, didn't think anything about it, went back home. When she wasn't home at 9 o'clock, we went to Peggy's, and there was no Donna.
Donna Martin had run away from home before, but this time it seemed like she wasn't coming back. Despite many attempts to find her, almost a year passed before Geneva Martin heard any news of her daughter. Then, one of Donna's friends told Geneva she had picked up Donna on the road and given her a ride to an apartment she was sharing in Baton Rouge. Geneva, desperately wanting to patch things up with her daughter, went to find her. But when she got there, the apartment was vacant. All that remained was Donna's name on the mailbox. The manager confirmed that Donna had been living there.
Excuse me, are you Mrs. Clark?
I took a picture of Donna to her, and she told me, yes, this was the young girl that had lived in the apartment with another married couple. From there, we found nothing.
Despite all she did to find her daughter, the trail remained cold for more than 20 years. Today, Geneva Martin hopes researchers at Louisiana State University will help heat it up again. Forensic anthropologist Mary Manheim and forensic artist Eileen Barrow use computers to simulate the aging process. If they can produce an accurate likeness of Donna Martin today at age 37, her mother may have a chance of finding her. LSU's Forensic Anthropology and Computer Enhancement Services, or FACES, is an ambitious program that's collecting data on the subtleties of the human face. Among its objectives, to develop precise standards of measurement for tissue thickness on the human skull. The information is used by forensic artists trying to build faces from bare bones. Until now, they relied on measurements based on cadavers. Manheim believes that using live subjects will produce much more accurate measurements. By using living models, Manheim can select from a much broader and more complete statistical range. Though subjects remain anonymous, their age, sex, race, height, weight, and other personal information becomes part of the computer's database. To measure tissue thickness, she uses an ultrasound scanner, like the ones used to show a fetus in the womb. The scanner bounces sound waves off the skull. By measuring the time it takes for waves to return, a computer calculates the exact depth of the tissue from skin to bone. The process is repeated at 19 points across the skull.
We've scanned over 400 and almost 500 people now, and those range in age from 2 years of age to approximately 74 years of age. There are many different sizes, many different racial groups, so we will separate these out, height, weight, age, etc., and we will produce standards.
Manheim has scanned the faces of generations of the same family. The data will show how family resemblances change over time. Manheim and her colleagues are also using computers to show what a missing child's face might look like as it grows older. With young children, the first step is stretching the child's features to reflect growth of the skull. In this case, a 5-year-old child disappeared and has been missing 5 years. Barrow renders the child at age 10. The computer stretching tool divides the face into a grid.
And you
pull each intersection of that grid down just a few steps. All right, so then that's the stretch. When we age a child, of course, the first thing we need is a picture of the child and a picture of her father and mother, or a sibling, or whoever the parent or the sibling might be that she looks most like.
The face can now be merged with the faces of her immediate family to create a composite image. With the click of a mouse, Barrow brings the missing child's features to the front.
To retain her particular look, the eyes and eyebrows, we would bring back a little bit of the shape of her nose and a little bit of the shape of her mouth. And then we would bring back or bring to the foreground her father's teeth, since she is, in this particular picture, the child had been missing for 5 years. So we were progressing her from 5 years old to about 10. So by that time, her teeth would have, of course, baby teeth would be gone and she would have permanent teeth. So we used the father's teeth to put in the picture.
The computer makes the manipulations easily, but Barrow must rely on her own judgment to decide which features to alter. Will the child look like a parent or more like her sibling? It's a question she'll need to answer when aging Donna Martin. Creating an image of what she might look like today will pose an extraordinary challenge. She'll have to be aged 21 years. Donna's face won't be stretched because at age 16 her face was fully developed.
All right.
Barrow will
Ms.
concentrate
Martin
on
brought us
other
the pictures.
techniques. First, photographs of family members close to the age Donna would be today are scanned into the computer. Because family members tend to age alike, this will help guide Barrow as she makes decisions about aging Donna. By studying the photographs, Barrow can begin to see at what stage the relatives begin to show crow's feet or lines around the mouth, and how severe they might be. She can also see when chins begin to droop or when necks begin to sag.
She really did not look very much at all like her sisters, which I expected that she would. And she really didn't have a lot of resemblance to her mother. So we had no pictures of her father at that age, so I decided that the best thing to do would be to try to merge her with her mother.
To merge the image of Donna Martin at 16 with her mother at age 40, Barrow must first align and resize the photographs. The photograph of Donna is a 3/4 view. To align it with her mother's, Barrow must adjust it to show a frontal view.
Now what happens here is that the mother's picture is quite a bit bigger than hers. So then what I have to do is size the picture of the mother. And that means reducing its size to try to fit the other one.
Barrow patiently and meticulously merges the photographs. She makes sure Donna's features remain dominant while taking some physical cues from her mother's image. Then she erases Donna's hairstyle at age 16 so a more mature style can be added. Finally, the transformation is complete. The 16-year-old Donna Martin has become a woman of 37.
Well, it looks a lot like our family. Oddly enough, it looks like my husband's family rather than myself.
Geneva Martin will distribute the image of Donna nationwide. She hopes it will finally reunite her with her daughter. and put to rest that fateful argument that's gone unresolved for 21 years. The work of one forensic artist may lead a daughter back to her mother. In one of forensic art's most acclaimed cases, another artist used his skills to lead police to a killer. In 1971, the quiet surface of a prosperous community was shattered by a brutal crime. A successful accountant, John Emil List, lived with his family in a mansion in Westfield, New Jersey. Then his fortunes waned. So in November of 1971, List began a new life. But first, he had to end his current one. He killed his entire family, his wife, 3 children, and his elderly mother. Then he dragged the bodies into the ballroom and arranged them neatly in a row. He tried to clean as much of their blood off the floor as he could. He also sat down to write a long letter of confession. When he finished, he left his house for the last time. A month passed before the Westfield police received a call from a woman concerned about her neighbors. She hadn't seen them home, and their lights had been on day and night until one by one they'd burned out.
I'm back either. I think we're going to have to make entry.
When the police arrived, they found an unattended mansion in need of repair. They looked around the outside of the house until they found an open window. When they entered, they had no idea what was waiting for them. The air was cold and filled with the odor of decay. They kept searching through the darkness until they finally came upon the List family in the ballroom, still neatly laid out, dead for a month. It was one of the most grotesque murders Westfield police had ever seen. When detectives were called in, they found the guns List had used and his letter of confession. List was an active member in the church and addressed the letter to his pastor. In it, he explained that he was no longer able to support his family and pay for the mansion his wife had insisted they buy. He was worried his family faced a life of humiliation on welfare. He was also upset his wife and children had stopped attending church. He felt his daughter had taken a misguided interest in acting, which threatened to deny her status as one of God's children. At least, he concluded, I'm certain they've all gone to heaven now. After slaying his family, List left his car at New York's Kennedy Airport and took a bus heading out of town. He hid his crime carefully. A month passed before anyone noticed his disappearance. Police and the FBI conducted a worldwide search, but nothing turned up. 18 years later, New Jersey detective Bernard Tracy was still on the case. He would make one last effort to find John Emil List by turning to the experts who combine art and science to age the human face. An accurate portrait of John List as a middle-aged man might alert someone somewhere to turn him in.
One thing I can tell you about the John List investigation, back in 1971, this was a state-of-the-art investigation.
Tracy was assigned to the case in 1974, taking over from detectives who'd been on the case for 3 years. The investigation was one of the most thorough ever conducted by New Jersey police. In their search for clues, detectives performed psychological profiles of List and his family.
We did little profiles on the victims. That was John List, his oldest son. his son Frederick, who was 13 at the time, and his daughter Patricia was 16.
Though the case had cooled by 1974, Tracy was convinced John List was still alive.
The common case is that when a person kills people close to them, they kill themselves shortly thereafter. If he wasn't found shortly thereafter dead, a victim of suicide, then I believed he would still be alive. It was just a question of where.
In an effort to find out, Tracy persuaded a television producer to include the case in a series on fugitives from justice. The producer, in turn, enlisted the expertise of Philadelphia forensic artist Frank Bender to sculpt the face of List as he might appear at age 63. The sculpture would appear on television for millions of people to see. If Bender could produce a good likeness of John List 18 years after the crime, he might finally be found. To help guide his imagination as he adds years to a face, Bender carefully reviews the subject's background and his habits, knowing they're unlikely to change. Behavior can influence how a person ages. Before starting the List project, Bender thoroughly researched his subject. He discussed List's psychological aspects with forensic psychologists and police experts.
Relax. If you mow your lawn in a suit and tie, you're not relaxed. It's about staying in control. He'll still be wearing probably the same clothes, the same type of bow tie. None of that's going to change.
You know, I've been going to a church on Sundays, and as often as I can, to try to get the feel of like what his environment is really like.
Any clue police gave him about List's life helped Bender form an image of how he may have aged.
Lifestyle, hairstyle, hobbies, hereditary factors. Then I either do my own psychological profile, as I've done in numerous cases, or as in this case, bring in a forensic psychologist and go back and forth with this individual, walk around the town for maybe 2 or 3 days, really get to know this person, put my feet in their shoes, and in a sense kind of become the person so I can stay one step ahead of them visually.
To obtain a scientific outlook on the aging process, Bender visited the medical school of the University of Pennsylvania. Here he consulted with Dr. Scott Bartlett, an expert in cranial and facial surgery and in repairing congenital deformities of the face. Dr. Bartlett's knowledge of the aging process, as reflected in the human face, made him a valuable ally. Bender was curious about the appearance of a scar behind List's ear from an operation.
The scar went from his ear down to at least his collar.
I would guess that, drawing the ear in something like this, more to the side of the head, and I would guess that there's bound to be, if he had an open mastoid operation, that he might have a fairly significant scar back here.
Dr. Bartlett pointed out that as List aged, wrinkles and folds in his neck could make the scar less noticeable. The two men also discussed how aging affects the eyelids and brows, which can change significantly over 18 years.
The canthal attachment here, which is the outer and the inner corners of the eye, I don't think change a lot. I think what we're seeing here is this hooding, this laxity of the soft tissue that's now falling over and giving this a downward slant, down and outward slant to the eye opening here, as opposed to this fresh up and out slant that you see in youth.
Ultimately, Frank Bender would apply his own intuition to what he learned about the case. Bender has been a sculptor for more than 30 years, showing his work in galleries and museums all over the United States.
Most of my studies are human behavior. I'm a people person. When I go to the beach, I don't look at the ocean as much as I like studying the people on the beach, how they interact, what they look like, the differences, what makes each person an individual.
Beginning his sculpture of John List, Bender had a problem. He had to construct a three-dimensional model, yet the only available photograph of List was a frontal view. There were no pictures showing a three-quarter or side view. Bender would rely on his experience as a commercial photographer to study the photograph and analyze its three dimensions based on highlight and shadow.
Now, with fugitives, you have old photographs. The most important thing with a fugitive, I found, is to stay within the perimeters of the skull. The same as facial reconstruction. This is where the similarities lie. If you elongate the head, you theoretically are changing the shape of the skull, the foundation underneath.
As he worked on his sculpture, he checked his work with acetate overlays made from the 20-year-old photograph.
I take an old photograph, enlarge it to what I feel would be life-size, do acetate overlays, and then lie it over the sculpture as I'm working on it to make sure that I'm within the perimeters of the skull.
As a face began to emerge from clay, Bender delved ever deeper into the mind of John List.
I felt that John List wanted to kind of be, in a sense, a generic individual. You know, wanted to blend in, didn't want to create waves. Wanted some peace in his life, which he never got from his wife. And this started building up his anxiety. I really believe he tried to get this through the church and was getting it. But when he came back home, it was complete overload.
Once the preliminary sculpture was complete, Bender and his assistant made a plaster cast.
That's good.
Little by little, Bender's sculpture took shape. By now, Bender was more familiar with List's face than with his own. As the bust of the fugitive emerged from its mold, Frank Bender was ready to add the final details to the face of a killer. John Emil List, after murdering his family, had evaded capture for 18 years. Whether police could find him would depend on Frank Bender's intuitive ability to imagine John List in his early 60s. Bender guessed that List's hairline continued to recede, as it had begun to do in his earlier photograph. He added jowls based on his assessment of List's lifestyle.
He wasn't an exercise type person. He was a potato and meat type person. As far as the eyes, you know, you can see where he's starting to get some lines. I look a little tired. You see, he has, I sculpted the tie and the shirt and the coat, you know, the suit coat on him, because he's always going to be wearing that.
Bender sensed that the years of hiding what he had done would take a toll on List. This influenced his decision to turn the corners of his mouth down.
You can see the corners of the mouth going down here rather than up like the photograph, which I'll bring right over. And you can see how they turned up. After 20 years, I'm having them go down. Not his whole mouth going down, just the corners. Again, not only aging, but the fear of getting caught.
As a final touch, Bender selected eyeglasses for the aged List. He searched for a style that would define a man who killed his entire family, yet called himself a Christian. He decided on thick black frames, thinking List might go for an austere, authoritative look that would discourage others from prying into his past. Now his sculpture was ready for the nation to see. On May 21st, 1989, millions of people across the United States saw Frank Bender's sculpture of John Emil List. Was the likeness good enough to catch the killer?
Oh my God, that's Bob Clark.
Ricky!
Yeah? Is that Mr. Clark? Yeah, it looks
One
like
of the
it.
viewers was a woman from Denver, Colorado. When she saw the bust, she called in. She said it looked just like her former neighbor, Robert P. Clark, who moved to Virginia.
Good morning. We're with the FBI. Yes, can you direct us to the office of Robert Clark, please?
Yes, Mr. Clark's office is...
Following up on the tip, FBI agents found a man who called himself Robert Clark at an office in Richmond, Virginia. After years of getting away with a horrible murder, List was about to see his last days as a free man. When the agents approached him, he insisted he was not John List. But on his neck was the telltale scar, and his fingerprints matched those of the killer. With that, the agents had proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Robert P. Clark and John Emil List were in fact the same man. Since the murders, John List had remarried and recreated his life as an accountant, confident that the crimes he'd committed in 1971 would never come back to haunt him. For Detective Bernard Tracy, it was the end of an incredible odyssey. A cold-blooded murderer finally captured after 18 years. By all accounts, the resemblance between the bust created by Frank Bender and the actual John List was uncanny.
I think the bust was something that if a person looked at that and had any doubt that that would be the straw that broke the camel's back, that would be the one. If they had any hesitation about calling and then they saw the bust, that would be the one that would take them over the edge and say, I got a call, this is him.
John Emil List was convicted of murdering his family and sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences. He and his unsuspecting new wife were attending a church function on the night Frank Bender's sculpture aired nationwide. As a result, they missed the show that gave John List yet another new start in life in New Jersey's State Penitentiary. Armed with photographs, scientific data, psychological profiles, and artistic talent, forensic artists breathe new life into unsolved cases. Using their unique knowledge of human physiology and human nature, they can help locate the missing, track murderers through time, and bring killers to justice.